tells people what to do. You have a detective intelligence officer called an antigen presenting cell. It goes out and finds intruders and finds information for the immune system to respond to. You've got the sniper, the shoot to kill guy, the infantry officer, we call them the CD8 killer T cells. And then you have the regular policeman who carries handcuffs. And when I say handcuffs, that's what antibodies are. If you hear antibodies, what are they? They're literally just handcuffs for a particular intruder. So what happens is that all these cells are made in the bone, the marrow of the bone, and then they leave the bone marrow and go to an organ called the thymus, which is in the upper chest. And that's what school is for them. In the thymus, they learn what makes you, you. What are your building blocks for your cells? We call those building blocks antigens. And for the rest of your life, after that, this detective you see on the screen is looking for two things. Anything that's not you, i.e. a virus or bacteria, or anything that's an altered version of you, a mutation of you, i.e. a cancer cell. What happens when he finds this intruder? He picks him up and carries him to the police station, i.e. lymph nodes. Lymph nodes, that's all they are. The ones in the head and neck, that's the precinct for any infection up here. The ones under the armpit, anything going on in the breast and upper back, that's what they are. They're just police stations. And in the police station, this detective presents this intruder to the general and said, General, look what I found. I found this guy, he's not one of us. The general calls in the police, i.e. the B cell, and say, cuff him. Calls in the sniper and says, Sniper, shoot him. But before you cuff him and shoot him, I need a favor from each of you. The B cell, the policeman, I need you to make a whole squadron, multiply a squadron of yourself that will have handcuffs specifically for this intruder. So that if he ever shows up again, you cuff him on arrival. You don't need the detective to find him first. You're there, you cuff him. Sniper, I want you to do the same thing. Have a SWAT team. These are the good guys on the right side of the scene, the snipers and the police, the memory T cells, we call them, the SWAT team. If you see this guy again, shoot him on arrival. Here's the problem, Bermuda. The time it takes to create this specialized force for this intruder takes 2 weeks. So if you run into a dangerous virus, it can do a lot of harm in 2 weeks before you have that specialized SEAL Team 6 security force to attack it. So what's a vaccine? Many, many years ago, scientists say, can we give the immune system a heads up about these dangerous intruders so that they can form these forces so that if they ever run into the real thing, they've got the security force before this thing can cause damage? No. If you listen carefully, measles, mumps, polio, 50, 60 years ago, what they did is they found this gunman, that virus on the bottom hand of the screen, took away his gun and gave you the live virus without the gun. So that's why people are like, oh my gosh, they got the vaccine. Yes, those vaccines were the live virus without the gun. That's not what the COVID vaccine is. So I see where that came from. What about the flu shot? What did they do? They took the gunman, took away his gun, killed him, and then gave you the dead gunman. They call it inactivated or killed virus. That's what the flu shot is each year. But that's not what the COVID vaccine is. They looked at this virus and they said, what makes it unique? They said, this guy has a green hat. And this hat is critical for him getting around. He's the only one with something like that. Specifically for the virus, it's that little red spike coming off the shell. We call it the spike protein. It's not the virus, just the protein. So if we give them the hat, i.e. the spike protein, will this detective now present it to the general, and general said to the police, hey, if you ever see anybody show up with this hat, cuff him. If you ever see anybody show up with this hat, shoot him. Not the virus, just the hat. We gave you just the hat. The hat can't hurt you because they're not giving you the live virus like they did back in the day. Because vaccinology has tried to get safer with time. But here's the fascinating thing. They found that if they gave you the hat alone, this SWAT team of killer T cells, they specialize at going after things that get inside cells. They didn't form a good SWAT team. It's like, oh gosh, so, do I have to give him the whole virus? No, they said, well, if we got the hat inside a cell, then it formed a really big army. So the question is, how do you get it inside a cell, i.e. inside a house? I want you to think of the entire body as a neighborhood, and every cell is a house. You have 37 trillion houses in this neighborhood. And you need to know what's in the house to understand how to get the hat in the house, i.e. the spike protein, not the virus, just the protein in the house. Every house has these little workmen, that little elf there, that repairs the house, helps build your cell, repair if a cabinet needs changing or if the bed needs repairing. This guy repairs it. He makes the proteins. And how does he know? Because he has a manual. He has an instruction booklet on how to repair your house and what makes you you. That booklet is called RNA, messenger RNA. That's what it is. It's literally just a booklet of what makes you up in your cell. There's another booklet called DNA. These ribosomes read the RNA booklet. So they said, I wonder if we can give him a booklet on just the protein, just that little hat. He makes the hat, now the hat's in the cell, and the immune system goes wild and says, there's something foreign in there. Let's create this army. So if it ever shows up, we'll kill it. That took 30 years to figure out. 30 years. It didn't happen overnight. They've been working on this, how to get the hat in the cell with this booklet for 30 years. And how did we learn how to do it? From viruses. If you look on the screen, that's exactly what viruses do. Here we have COVID binding to your cell, the SARS virus, and what it does, it deposits its own booklet in you, hijacks your workmen. They use the booklets of the virus to make the virus. It ravages your cell using all the raw material, multiplies and moves to the next house and keeps going, destroying houses one by one. So we said, can we create a shell, deposit the booklet that tells you how to make the hat? The hat's in there now, and then you create an immune response. So now you know what RNA is. It's just a booklet. Now you know all they've done is given you the hat, not the virus. What's the difference between the vaccines? So Pfizer and Moderna, that shell that delivers the book, that tells you how to make the protein, delivers the RNA, they made the shell in the lab. And what did they make it out of? Fat. Lipid is the medical term for fat. Nano means small. It's not a chip. It just means small. Particle, a small particle of fat. In cases this book drops it inside you, because without it, it just broke down the book. The book never got there. And they had to use decades of research to figure that out. Oxford and Johnson & Johnson, they took a little harmless virus, gutted its insides, and just took its shell, it's called the adenovirus, and used that as the vector, as the shell to transmit its book. The first three, you need 2 shots in order to say, oh, the immune system say, yep, this hat's a problem. We need to create an army about anything that shows up with this hat. Johnson & Johnson did it in 1 shot. No, everybody's talking about which one's better than the other. They had different measures of how to figure out which one is efficacious. All of them are good. All of them prevent 100% of the time disease, ICU admission, and death. Now you're like, hold on. We can still get infected. Hold that thought. Let's talk about the difference. If you get infected and you're not vaccinated, what happens? What happens to the virus? The virus, as I tell you, just wants to bind to your cell, hijack your workmen, and multiply. But what's unique to viruses? Every time they multiply, they change a little. So look at this gunman. He's got a blue jacket, he's got a green hat, he's got a gun over his back. Sometimes he just changes his coat. If he's got a yellow coat, red coat, may not be a big difference. Sometimes they pick up a bigger gun. So what does that mean? You got a more deadly virus. What happens if they change their hat? No, that's a problem, because the vaccines are now all against this green hat. So if somebody gets infected and the virus changes in that person, you've now created a new monster that the vaccinated people are not protected against. And we're back to square one. So current vaccines wouldn't work against if they change the hat. So far, the hat hasn't changed enough. Out of the millions of variants that are out there, remember, he needs the hat to get around. It's changing a little bit, but it hasn't changed enough that we still aren't protected. If you are vaccinated, you got your sniper at the door, you've got the police at the door waiting on some guy to show up with the green hat. They cuff him and they shoot him. So what ends up happening? You got infected, i.e. he broke in the front door, your security force is there, but he can't do anything because they cuffed him. So yeah, I tested positive, but he can't multiply. And if he can't multiply, then there's a very, very low chance of you spreading it. And guess what? Even more importantly, he can't change. He can't change his hat. Therefore, you can't create a different monster. So it's not just protecting you from getting sick. It's protecting you from being the host that creates the new monster. This isn't the first time we've seen this monster. SARS in 2003 was corona. MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome sickness, was corona in 2012. 2019, it came back. It's like Terminator 2. That's why they call it SARS-CoV-2. It just changed. You don't want to be the one being the host that causes this virus to change and then damage everyone else as well, not just yourself. If you get infected or not vaccinated, what about my own immunity? Why do I need the vaccine? If I get it and I recover, won't I be immune? Won't I have the security force against this thing that just infected me? And then therefore, why don't they count me in part of this herd immunity? The thing is, each person, what we've learned when they get infected and attacked by this monster, I might create antibodies against the blue jacket. You might create antibodies, handcuffs against anything with a gun. Tom might create antibodies against the hat. We all create antibodies to different parts of the virus. That's why they say some antibodies are protective and some aren't. Some create a lot of antibodies and some don't. What we know is that if we give you just the hat, the antibodies you create will protect you against any form of the virus that's out there right now, and that it'll be protective. So that's why if I just caught it, I may have antibodies against the blue jacket. And then this thing changed, has a yellow jacket. I'm not even protected 3 months from now because I'm looking for something with a blue jacket. So they can't count me as part of the ones who are immune. So how do we get herd immunity if this thing keeps changing? Thankfully, it hasn't changed its hat yet. So if we vaccinate as many people as possible while it still has a green hat, now there's so few people left in which this thing could actually change, it eventually dies out because our security forces cuff him and kill him before he can multiply or change. Now, has this thing been changing the hat? Yes. That's why even though there are millions of variants, the ones that people talk about, the UK variant, the South African variant, the Brazilian variant, why are they notable? Because the hat, the spike protein is what is changing a bit. Thankfully, it's still green, but it might be a baseball cap instead of a top hat. And your immune system still recognizes it. If you look on these numbers, 84 to 74%, there's a slight decrease in how much it recognizes it, but still recognizes it really strongly that it will attack it. It's a race against time. Can we vaccinate enough people before this thing changes? And if it changes past what we need, that's why we may need a booster, because we need something else. If it's changed past the green hat, so far we're not there yet. So far we're not there yet. We're still protected because all the variants have this green hat. If you're infected and not vaccinated, what happens to you? Remember I said these viruses like to break into houses? Each of them have a host that they like. This virus likes to break into your lung cell, the pneumocyte, the cell that exchanges oxygen and carbon dioxide. That's why your oxygen levels fall when it destroys those houses by multiplying itself. But that's not the only thing it does. It's not whether, oh, I survived or I died. If you survived, a lot of evidence is coming out now. You can check the CDC website where it's affected your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, your skin, your brain. The long-term effects they're talking about the long haulers where people are handicapped. They're damaged on all the organs because they caught this thing. All that data is still coming out. What we know about side effects of the vaccine, everybody might get a little soreness for a day from the shot, but you know when you go for your next shot 3 weeks later, your immune system has the army because it's been more than 2 weeks. That army works better when your temperature is a little higher. That's why you have a little fever when you get the hat again, not because you got the virus, because you got the hat. He says, hold on, is he here? No, you got chills and fevers and you have aches and pains as the immune system is scouring the body to find an intruder. It doesn't find any virus. So after 12 hours, symptoms are gone. Those symptoms were from your immune system responding, not the virus. Now, while I leave everything else to the rest of my panel, please submit your questions. Happy to answer them. And thanks for listening, Bermuda.
Mm-hmm. And thank you. Thank you, Dr. R. Scott. We will be back and, of course, taking some questions. You touched on that herd immunity, which has been a lot of questions. So we got questions coming on that. Right now, we'll turn it over to Dr. Karika Weldon. Dr. Weldon, how are you this evening? Please tell us a little bit. We know about you, but give us a little bit before you start a little bit about yourself before you start the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Evans. And thank you, Dr. R. Scott, for that great foundation. So my name is Dr. Karika Weldon. I am a biochemist by trade. If I had to call myself anything, I've done a PhD in biochemistry. And the, I guess, notable thing about that is that the entire time I've done any type of research has been in mRNA. My parents are probably tired of hearing about RNA. My friends are probably tired about hearing it. They've heard it for about a decade now. I've held conferences in Bermuda about RNA. My field was specifically on splicing and how the RNA is processed before it creates those proteins. And today I will elaborate a bit on exactly what is in the mRNA vaccine. It is a new technology to the world and want to share exactly what's inside of it and just clarify the ingredients, first of all, and then how it's supposed to work. All right. Okay, so what is in the mRNA vaccine? There are essentially 5 ingredients. That's it. You do have your water, obviously. I think we know it needs to be able to get into our bloodstream, and our bloodstream is mostly water. So that's check. We have that. It has a number of salts. I think there's exactly 4. And the salts are there because when the vaccine enters our bloodstream, our blood is actually very much a certain pH level, and it needs to be that way in order for our body to function. And so when we add the vaccine into our bloodstream, we don't want that to tamper with what's already there. And so the vaccine has certain levels of salt so that it can easily get into our bloodstream and not disrupt our overall pH in our blood. Then we have some sugar. And the primary reason for the sugar is so that when it's frozen, which I think we may have heard that this particular vaccine has to be frozen at a really low temperature, it is still viable. Okay, so I'll get to why it needs to be frozen in a minute, but the sugar's main role is to ensure that when it is frozen, it's able to be preserved. And then the other notable ingredient that we may know about is the fat. And the fat has a very specific job. And all it has to do, as Dr. R. Scott touched on earlier, is to protect and be around the main package, which in this case is our mRNA. So the mRNA by itself is a very fragile molecule in the system, in our bodies. It's very transient. It will be there for a few hours. I think the half-life is around 6 hours. So it will be there, it will be made, it will do its job, and then it will get broken down. So in order for us to have a vaccine that can be created, distributed, and then used, it needs to have something around it that gives it that protection and allows it to actually do its job, which is to get into those cells or those houses and deliver the message. Those are the 5 ingredients in the vaccine. There's no chips. There's nothing else in there. There's actually, I think, 10 or 11 ingredients that are listed out, and that's all of them put together and why they're there. So just to dive a bit into what is mRNA, right? So I think everyone is familiar with DNA. DNA is the blueprint. It gives us exactly how to make every part of our body, but it's very, very fragile. And as you know, if you try to change your DNA, it could lead to issues. A lot of diseases that are passed down, like sickle cell, for example, is a change in only one part of the DNA, and that can cause a disease. And so we want to make sure at all costs that our DNA is kept safe. And so what actually happens is, yes, this is the blueprint, but it gets converted into a temporary message. So the M for mRNA is messenger RNA, and RNA is a very similar type molecule to DNA, has just one chemical difference. But now I love food, so I always like to use analogies that talk about food. So if we can imagine, DNA is like our cherished family cookbook. It has all the recipes tried and tested, and we know it's awesome, but we want to make sure we keep that recipe book very safe, so that to give out the actual book just in case something happens to it. And so we have our little flashcards that have the exact same instructions as the cookbook, but now is in a mobile version, and we can make lots of copies of that as well. Now ultimately, that is like our RNA. It has the message, it's a temporary version, but there's no way that the RNA can affect in any way, shape, or form what happens to the cookbook. All its job is to ensure that the end product can be made. And in this case, we have a nice soup on the screen. In the case of mine, I love farine pie. That is the end goal, and that is what is made from the messenger RNA. Now, putting this all together, I talked about the fat earlier. Now, what's interesting is this is a lipid nanoparticle, as Dr. Oscar touched on. Now, I like to think about it as like bubble wrap. I know when we have our very fragile shipments that come in, they come bubble wrapped because what's inside is so precious, and we don't want to damage it in transit. This is exactly the same thing as this lipid nanoparticle. Again, lipid is just another name for fat, and it's actually something that is surrounding all of our cells. So this is actually a picture of the lipid bilayer. So there's two layers of fat here, and this surrounds all of our cells in a very ingenious way. Now, in order for anything to enter the cell, it has to be able to kind of merge with our lipid bilayer, and then it will allow whatever's inside of that to come in. So this is something that has taken decades. It's a method of delivery into the cell that has been noticed, as Dr. Oscar mentioned, from viruses. And so that is why this particular vaccine is packaged in a lovely fat bubble wrap that will allow it to get into the cell. And once it's there, the message is delivered right to the ribosome. That is our machinery that will convert this message into the product. And then that spike protein will be able to go out and trigger that whole army that our body is so great at using to fight off disease. And so the mRNA vaccine, it's something that has been in discovery, in testing for a very long time. I myself remember hearing about it in the early 2010s at conferences, and to see it all come together is quite exciting. So this is our mRNA vaccine. Happy to hand over and hand back to you, Ms. Evans, and happy to take any of those questions that will be coming a bit later.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Weldon. We actually do have some questions coming about the mRNA. That's coming, so we'll do that on the other side. Right now, we're saying hello to our Chief Medical Officer. We call him Dr. Ayo, and he doesn't mind it, so we thank you for that. Dr. Ayo, another busy one. It's time. Tell us a little bit about yourself, okay, and then jump right into your presentation.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Ayo Oniloye. I've been in posts for 8 months, since August last year. My background is in medicine. I trained as a doctor. I have 22 years experience as a doctor, and 12 of those has been as a specialist in public health. I've had experience of working as a director of public health, as a consultant in public health, and a consultant in communicable disease control. My areas of interest are in health protection, healthcare, public health, medical education, and infection prevention and control. So today I'm going to be talking about right. Just give me 1 second and get this right. Okay. Right. So today I'm going to be talking about the process of vaccination in Bermuda. I'll talk a little bit about the vaccines we have on island, and also address some of the themes that are coming up in the questions that people have been asking so far. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the model of the vaccination program that we have in Bermuda. We have 2 vaccine centers, one at Bermuda College, and the second at the King Edward's Memorial Hospital, the old A&E site. In addition to that, we have teams that are vaccinating in rest homes and in prisons, and we are putting together a mobile vaccination center, mobile vaccination team that will be going around the island. So that's Bermuda College, and that's the hospital site. I want you to all watch out for announcements that will be coming out early next week around the mobile vaccinations at both the east and west ends of the island. The other thing to mention is that Bermuda College is now accepting walk-ins. So that's for this weekend. Please, if you want to have your shots, please walk into Bermuda College and you can get your shots straight away tomorrow. The hours of opening are likely to change from next week, and watch out for that announcement as well. So what happens when you want to get vaccinated? You need to register. And if you go to gov.bm, this is the landing page you see. And on this part is the COVID-19 vaccination registration. So click on this and it takes you to a form where you can register. And that is probably the simplest way of doing it. If that's not possible, you can shoot an email to vaccines@gov.bm, and that is also a way of getting registered. If you are not able to do any of the above, you can also call the vaccine center at the number here. So what then happens after registering? Your name is noted on the system, and then you get an email confirming your registration, and an email giving you an appointment. You also get a text message to tell you this is the time of your appointment, and this is where you need to go for your appointment. So that's what happens with that. Okay, so if you then move on to on the day of your vaccination, you go to the vaccine center, and you went on arrival, you have a temperature check, they ask you questions about yourself, and then you'll be required to confirm your identity. Usually we will go for either your passport or your driving license to confirm your identity, and then the next step is to talk you through the whole process and make sure you understand what is about to happen, and we take your consent to be able to give you the vaccination. And then you get vaccinated. And after your vaccination, there's a waiting area where you sit for 15 minutes just to make sure that everything is okay before you go. And you'll be like me, and you'll be vaccinated. Okay, so a little bit about the vaccines available in Bermuda at the moment. We have the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. That's what Dr. Weldon and Dr. Ascott have been talking about so far. That's the one that is mRNA-based platform. Also, we have the AstraZeneca vaccine. That's the one that Dr. Ascott described as the Green Book, which is based on a harmless virus that has been changed so that it can express the green heart of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and allow your body to develop the immunity required to fight this disease. We are also expecting to get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, but we don't know when that's going to be at the moment. So these are the vaccines that are available on Ireland. So you have heard a lot about some of the side effects that you may have with vaccines. And I want to just major on the discussions around the risk of blood clots, so that I can put a little bit of perspective into this. So blood clots from vaccines are very rare. They are a recognized complication of the vaccines that depend on the Green Book as described by Dr. Ascott. So this is vaccines that are made from cells that have been rendered harmless, but can present the green heart of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So they do, there is that risk of blood clots with the vaccine. However, let's get a little bit of sense of proportionality with this. For the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is what we have on Ireland, what the literature describes is 4 cases in a million. So compare that to the risk of blood clots when you, for women who are using the combined oral contraceptive pills, is somewhere between 500 and 1,200 cases per million. For people who smoke, we're almost at 2,000 cases per million of the blood clot risks. And if you actually, unfortunately, have a COVID infection, actually almost 200,000 out of a million, almost 1 in 5 will have issues with blood clots. Another way of expressing it is if you look at the risks of blood clots in people who've been hospitalized, is actually 1 in 20 from COVID. And people who have not been hospitalized, it could be about 1 in 100. The risk of blood clots from pregnancy is about 1 in 1,000. If you had to have surgery you are immobilized for a period of time, it's between 5 and 7 per 1,000. And again, from contraceptive pills, as I said, it's between 1 and 3 per 3,000 and 3,500. If you are obese, that risk factor on its own is 6 in 100,000. Whereas if you look at the risks from AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson, because they're very similar, it's anything between 1 and 10 per million. So that gives a sense of the scale. I know that there's been a lot of discussion around the type of clots that you get from AstraZeneca and from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, because it's also associated with low platelets. But I hope this explains the risks that you can have with compares the risks of clots in the vaccine as compared to regular everyday things. Now, actually, I find this actually more interesting because it actually breaks this down by age. And this is weighing up the potential benefits and harms of the AstraZeneca vaccine, where there's high exposure. And that is defined as exposure where you have incidence of 20 per 10,000. Which is roughly what the UK had at its peak of its outbreak. We are between 12 and 15 per 10,000, but we think that that might be an underestimate. So we're not a million miles away from this. And look at this. The risks and benefits of the AstraZeneca vaccination actually increases with age. But at no point does the risk of AstraZeneca vaccination exceed the risk of ICU admissions due to COVID-19 every 16 weeks. The odds are just, the odds are just in the favor of getting the vaccine. That's the reality of this. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about is you may have heard that we don't know the long-term effects of this vaccine. This vaccine was developed so quickly, and we don't know the long-term effects of this vaccine. And that's actually true. The vaccine was developed at very breakneck speed by vaccine development terms. It takes a lot of time to develop vaccines. However, this was a convergence of all of scientific knowledge and the funding to be able to do it at the time, being converging at the same time. And as you heard from Dr. Ascott and Dr. Weldon, this has been several decades in the making. The final, jumping over the final hoop took a short period, but this is several decades in the making. But however, what I want to remind you of is that vaccines are not new things. The picture I have here is that of Edward Jenner, who vaccinated a child with the pustules from cowpox from a milkmaid and prevented that child from developing smallpox. Smallpox is one of the in fact, that's the only infectious human disease that has been completely eradicated. And the only reason we're able to eradicate this is because of vaccination. So we have had 2 centuries, Bermuda. That's 200 years of vaccine development. And throughout this 200 years of vaccine development, what we know is that virtually all the side effects that you can see from a vaccine starts within the first 6 weeks. And that is why none of these vaccines have been approved if they have not gone, if they've not been tested for at least 2 months. That allows us to see the range of side effects you expect from any vaccine. So yes, it's been developed very quickly, but none of the steps have been skipped. And it's been tested for long enough for us to know virtually all the side effects that we expect to get from this vaccine. And my final slide was basically to talk about some of the other questions I've seen people ask about who has liability for any harm that comes from this vaccine. And that's a very valid and legitimate question to ask. So I titled this slide from liability to indemnity and everything in between. So the first thing to say is that yes, because this is a global effort at vaccine development, some of the old rules don't apply, and that the rules needed to have been modified to allow for the whole world to come together and develop these vaccines. And that means that the manufacturers of this vaccine, those who have developed this vaccine, they're still responsible and liable for any product defect or any poor quality product that comes out from them. So they are not absolved of that liability at all. In our case, our vaccines came from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK, and they are responsible for transporting the vaccines from the UK over here. So if anything happens to the vaccine in transit, that's their responsibility. Our responsibility as the responsibility of the government of Bermuda is in the transportation and storage and administration of these vaccines while they are on island. So if anything goes wrong in those 3 areas, the government of Bermuda is responsible. We're fortunate that the vaccines that we have on Ireland have been given to us by the United Kingdom government, I should say. And we are also covered by the vaccine protection that the United Kingdom government offers. So if we have any vaccine harm coming as a result of the vaccines given to us by the UK government, we are covered by their indemnity, and that covers for any vaccine harm. And I must quickly add that to date, we have not had any harm coming from the vaccination program. The other thing I want to quickly mention is that for the first time in the world, we now have a no-fault compensation program for COVID vaccines. So for all the vaccines we get from the COVAX facility, I think it's 10 pence per vaccine is set aside as a no-fault compensation program. So where there's a demonstrable harm from vaccines, people can draw down from that fund without having to involve the courts or anything. All you need to do is to demonstrate that the harm has come from the vaccines. And of the millions of doses of vaccines that have been given, there's not been any claim so far from the COVAX facility. The other thing to mention is that staff who are working for us at the vaccine centers, while they may have their own individual professional liability cover, the government of Bermuda is also providing liability cover for the staff who are working for us at the vaccine center. So I'm going to pause there and let my colleague present our bit, and then I will take any questions that may arise.
Thank you, Dr. Ayo. Appreciate that. And yes, we're going to quickly move to, because we have lots of questions coming through, quickly move to your colleague, Daiwan DeRosa, epidemiologist. And Daiwan, we'll say a few words, tell us about yourself, and then let's go to your presentation.
Good evening, everyone. I hope I can be as dynamic as the previous presenters, but I am presenting a lot of data. There are data questions, but I'm not sure how exactly to make data exciting. So do bear with me as I go through a lot of slides. I will talk about my role as I go through the presentation. So I'm just going to start the presentation now. All right, are we seeing it? Because I'm still kind of new to the Zoom stuff. Can we see it?
You're fine. You're ready.
All right, great.
On the screen. On the screen. No worries.
So the Bermuda situation. So I know people have been clamoring for this data, vaccinations, cases, hospitalizations, deaths, and adverse events. But first, a bit about myself. I am the epidemiologist here with the Ministry of Health. I've been here about 15 years or so, and we've dealt with other pandemics before, well, potential pandemics before, and then this one came along. So there were tools in our basket, and we've been training for this. So I think we have a great team. A lot of people have said, what is an epidemiologist? We consider ourselves kind of disease detectives. So we look at lots of different types of diseases and conditions and what patterns there might be, so that we can figure out where they're coming from, where they might be going, and put interventions in place to try and stop their spread. Why am I the only one with this? Bear with me. Okay. So the Epidemiology and Surveillance Unit comes under the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, and there are currently 4 of us on staff, myself, the epidemiologist, and for the COVID pandemic, I am also the head of the health data team. So all of the statistics that you see regarding cases and deaths and the press releases, that comes out of the health data team, which is actually just 2 of us, maybe 2.5 sometimes. So I'd have to definitely thank my colleagues for being able to get this data to you in timely manner. There's also the nurse epidemiologist, and she oversees the contact tracing. She does more field epidemiology and also works with me and the chief medical officer and others on policy. There's the surveillance nurse, and she, in regards to the COVID situation, is currently responsible for adverse event reporting. And then we have the surveillance officer, and part of her role is coding underlying causes of death. So how do we do this? We get data from physicians and from laboratories, and we work with numerous organizations such as the World Health Organization, Pan American Health Organization, Caribbean Public Health Agency, and Public Health England to get data, transform it into information, and hopefully that information leads to action. So, what you've been waiting for. So here are the COVID-19 cases by transmission classification and epidemiological week. We've had questions, why are things now being done by epidemiological week, or Epi week as we call them? It's so that epidemiologists around the world know exactly what dates we are talking about. So the Epi week runs from Saturday to Sunday, and it just helps us to see patterns and things like that. So I've started this chart at Epi Week 2 because our vaccination program actually rolled out in Epi Week 2. So January 11th was the start of our vaccination program with phase 1, and that was to persons aged 80 and over. But let's talk about the cases first. So in Epi Week 2, there were 19 cases, and you see that it drops down to 1 case in Epi Week 5. You might not even be able to see that, it's so small. And 1 case in Epi Week 6, and then it starts to pick back up in Epi Week 7. And then by the time you get to Epi Week 14, which was about 2 weeks ago, because we're currently in Epi Week 16, we're at 470 cases compared to 7 cases just 12 weeks before. So what happened from Epi Week 7 to Epi Week 14? So here's just the same graph, just because I'm going to focus the presentation on Epi Week 7 to Epi Week 14. So what happened is during that week, we identified the variant first identified in the UK, B117. So in Epi Week 7, only 33% of the cases were of the UK variant. By Epi Week 11, 100% of the cases are of the UK variant, which we know is more transmissible. So how did we go from 19 cases to 470? Partly because of the UK variant. Also because of how people mingle, how people be within 6 feet of each other, how people don't wear masks or follow public health guidelines. So I mentioned that in Epi Week 2, we rolled out the immunization program, and that was for persons aged 80 and over. So 2-dose vaccine, 3 weeks from that, they would be getting their second dose. So that would be Epi Week 5. And then 2 weeks from that for a full immune response. So that would be Epi Week 7. So only in Epi Week 7 would those aged 80 and over have the immune response. The other phases rolled out in March, and it then takes about 5 weeks for them to get their first dose, their second dose, and the 2 weeks to get their immune response. So this is just looking at COVID vaccine coverage by Epi Week. And this was the coverage as of Epi Week 13, because even though I'm talking through Epi Week 15, it's at Epi Week 13 that we would know how many people had the full 2-dose and 2-week coverage by Epi Week 15. So the age distribution of the cases, the hospitalizations, and the deaths. So these are persons that would have been diagnosed between Epi Week 7 and Epi Week 15. So anyone that was diagnosed between the 14th of February and the 17th of April. And during that time, there were 1,534 new cases of coronavirus. Of those, of the cases, which is the light blue graph, 36% were in the 20 to 39 age group, 30% in the 40 to 59 age group, with less on the edges of under 20 and very few over the age of 80. For the hospitalizations, it shifts, with the persons aged 40 to 59 and 60 to 80 making up the majority of the cases. And with the deaths, which is the gray, there were 78 hospitalizations over that period. And in the gray, where there were 11 deaths, and all of those were over the age of 60. So now the same thing by vaccination status. For the cases, 89% of the cases did not have any doses of the vaccine. 4% had 1 dose, 2% had 2 doses, and 5% would have been considered having a sufficient immune response of 2 doses and 2 weeks. For the hospitalizations, 92% had no doses, 8% 1 dose, and none had 2 doses or 2 doses plus 2 weeks. And for the deaths, 91% had no doses, and 9% had 2 doses, but not 2 doses and 2 weeks prior to contracting coronavirus. So for adverse events, an adverse event is anything that takes place after an immunization and causes concern in the person and is thought to be caused by the immunization. But there has to be an investigation to see whether it's a true adverse event, a vaccine reaction. So that's something that's caused by a component of the vaccine, whether it can be a program error, something that's generated by the way the vaccine is administered, whether it's an injection reaction, which is an event just arising from anxiety from having the vaccine, or if it's a coincidence. So for Bermuda, when an adverse event occurs, the process is dependent on where the adverse event occurs. If it happens in the vaccination center, then the vaccination center personnel will complete the reporting form and submit it to the surveillance nurse. If it happens at home or at any other place, then the person that has the event should seek a physician or a hospital, or go to the hospital if it's considered to be severe, and the physician will then report into our office through the surveillance nurse. The surveillance nurse will start the investigation to determine whether it's a serious event or a not serious event, such as the common side effects of a vaccine. If the surveillance nurse determines that it is a severe event, then they take it to BASIC, which is the Bermuda Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices. Now we will review it. There's a bunch of us on BASIC from the Ministry of Health. There are private physicians. There are nurses with long experience in immunization programs. And if need be, we will call in any specialist that we need to deal with the situation. We will go through that review and determine if this is a true event that can be attributed to the immunization. If we cannot come to a conclusion, then we do have the option to elevate this to the Pan American Health Organization. This is not a swift process. We have to look at the background data. Could this have happened by chance? And there's quite an extent. Week 15, almost 51,000 vaccines had been, 40 adverse events had been reported. We know that there is underreporting. Just because people might not know that 14 were considered to be serious. Of the 14, 1 required an ER visit, 4 required a hospitalization, and 9 are considered other important medical events, which would require a physician. And these are the types of things that have been reported through our adverse event system. So you can see quite clearly that most of them are not quite serious, such as pain, fatigue, fever, headaches, rash. But there are some that have been elevated to basic and are going through the process. So thank you very much. And here are some websites for more local information.
And thank you, Ms. DeRosa. Panelists, it's time for questions, and we have several. So we'll put our cameras on and get started. Let's start off with Dr. Weldon. You talked about the DNA. There's been several questions about DNA. Will the vaccine interfere with someone's DNA? Has it been proven? Do we know it? Talk about it.
Thank you for that question. So I know that has been a very common question,
Right.
and I'm happy to say that it cannot. Every molecule in the cell has its own role, and mRNA has very much limitations on what it can and cannot do. mRNA is created in the nucleus. It's a copy made of the DNA, right, by some enzymes that after the process of transcription give you the mRNA. It goes through some processing, and that's splicing, what my field of specialty is. And actually it's packaged to leave the nucleus and go out of the nucleus to then go to the ribosome and be used to make the protein. There's no way for that mRNA to get back into the nucleus. And so it's almost like when you, like a very common example, when you drive, let's say at Bermuda College, you can drive by the gym, but you can't reverse back. You cannot, because if you reverse, I mean, you could, but then you wouldn't have a car anymore. So there's a way that you can allow the mode of transport to go in a certain direction and prevent things from going a certain way. We have that, a very physical way of seeing that. It's the same in the cell. There are certain actions that cannot be reversed. It has to come out of the nucleus. It goes to the ribosome. It's used to make multiple copies of the protein that it encodes for, and then it's broken down. And that's really the main reason why, number one, the vaccine has to be kept at a cold temperature, the mRNA vaccines, because mRNA is very fragile. It's finicky. It's very high maintenance. It needs very good conditions to be kept, intact. And so you have to make sure it's that temperature so that it doesn't break down. And that's the other reason why your COVID test, the nasopharyngeal swab, has to go on ice, because even that, if it's hot and our Bermuda summer, it could basically bake the mRNA and it will be gone. So it has to be, it has to be very clear that the mRNA can do nothing, not a thing to DNA. It can only be made as a copy of it. It goes out. It does its job by delivering the message. That's it.
And that's it. So the big question, everyone wants to say, and actually, Dr. Iyer, you touched on it as well, is that, well, how long have we studied this? I mean, is it long enough that we know? Do we know this? How will we know? And both of you can chime in on this one. The effects of
Well, I studied mRNA back in the 90s in medical school.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been around for that long. I didn't do a PhD. Ramon and Karika did PhDs. They looked at this in depth and they can tell you a lot more about it. But I mean, back in the 90s, we were already talking about mRNA.
Right. Let's go to this. There's this question about the for Dr. Weldon, but I'm going to open it up for anyone. And trust me, we're going to get to that herd immunity because I've got a lot of questions about that here. Doctor, what's this about the viral load? Dr. Weldon, can you speak about the viral
PCR test, because that is the manufacturer's recommended amount of cycles, okay? But as far as where we do the cutoff, that is at 40, and we have grouped the data at this point on being between 35 and 40. So that's what you call low level positive, between 30 and 35, which is also what we would probably say low level, between 25 and 30. Now we're getting into, there's probably a medium, if we could say that. And then under 25, we're pretty sure you are very infectious, and most of the symptomatic persons fall into that category. Now, what I have on the screen is a comparison of the CP values in our last outbreak in December versus now, where we have obviously the two different variants. It's very clear to see that in the last outbreak, we had a lot of people between 25 and 30. We had a number of under 25, but majority were between that 25 and 35 range. And one of the points I forgot to mention is the lower your CP value, the more infectious you are. You have a lot more virus in you, so you can give a lot more away. This is when sharing is not caring. So you can think in the last outbreak, people had, obviously they had the virus, but it wasn't that much compared to this particular outbreak, where you see almost the same amount, around 40% of the positive cases this time are under 25. And under 25 means like you are bursting at the seams, essentially. Anyone that comes in contact with you will be positive. That's almost like a guarantee. And we can see that when we look at the close contacts that are tested. I know in the last outbreak, if you tested, maybe a few of the close contacts will come up positive, but this time, 2 handfuls, like just pretty much everyone at some point has converted to being positive. And it's indicative of the fact that we have people that are more infectious. And in December, we didn't have any vaccinated persons. If I just go forward to look at the difference between vaccinated, having 1 dose, having 2 doses, and being fully immunized, you can again see, look, blue is bad in this instance. In unvaccinated persons, 40% under 25. That's pretty much around the same as you saw in the last graph. And then these two together is like 60% are under 30. Now, if you compare that to first dose, which looks pretty much similar, but if you look at second dose and even fully immunized, you're talking about like 5 to 10% under 25. Like you can see, there's not much blue here. A lot more of it is in this 30 to 35 region. And when we look at fully immunized, you're actually seeing even more are between 35 and 40. So you can see the shift is very clear. We know now that there are different levels of positivity, as we like to call it. The more people that we have that are very contagious, the quicker this thing spreads.
Okay.
The less we can try to contain it. And so you can see, as per what the information that Daiwan showed, it kind of correlates, right? Because you start to see like, hey, there's not many people with this high amount of virus in this category. And when you have that high amount, that makes you more sick. And then that makes you be hospitalized, and then, leads down that path. Okay. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, that also, we have several questions regarding that, because you'll see a lot of young people that will say, well, if I get the disease, and if I have it and I have COVID and I have the virus, then I'm immune. Speak to that, and therefore I don't need to be vaccinated. I'm immune now. Who wants to touch that?
Is that for me?
Yeah, you can pick it up. You can pick it up. Feel free.
I think, yeah, Ramon, please go for it.
All right, great. All right, so I'm going to build on what Dr. Weldon said, and I'm going to address that because we touched on it in the presentation. I want everybody to hear me again. I'll share my screen as well, so that you can follow along. Let me see if I can actually pull it up. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to pull up the screen here. All right. Okay. All right, so what I want you all to remember is that we ask the question, if I caught COVID and my immune system dealt with it, I should be immune. That's what people are thinking. But you need to remember that if John catches COVID, he might make antibodies to the blue jacket. Mary might make antibodies to the green hat. Which antibodies you make varies between people. And the amount varies between people depending on how strong that person's immune system is or not. And not all the antibodies are protective, like the antibodies to the jacket. Some of us might have antibodies to the green hat. And what we know is that you will be immune because all the variants have this green hat. All of them have the spike protein. So if we give you the vaccine, which is just the green hat, we know that no matter what you run into, you'll be immune. But if you caught the virus, your immune response varies between people. So not everybody who caught COVID will have the right army to fight it, because you might form antibodies against the shoes or the shirt, and this one might find antibodies against the gun. So that's why they say, look, if you are vaccinated and you got the security force, they cuff him and shoot him before he can multiply. And to Dr. Weldon's point, if it multiplies, you get so many going house to house, and you also have so many that you can pass it on to someone else. But if you've cuffed him and shot him, he can't multiply. Therefore, you have less to give, i.e. you're less infectious because you have the security force to hold that guy down, which is why the vaccinated ones, when you look on Dr. Weldon's graph, that blue graph was so small, i.e. the ones who had enough to give were very, very few to none. That's why the transmission was less. Okay?
Yeah, so Dr. Ascott, and to the panel, we've had a couple of questions here. Are we supposed to get another vaccine shot? I think Dr. I actually talked about this.
Tina, could I just quickly add to Ramon's point about that? So Ramon's given a very beautiful explanation of why that happens. And I'll tell you the reality pointed out. The predominant strain now is the B117 strain. They've now tested positive. Did they develop antibodies against the wild type virus? They probably did. But again, because the virus has changed slightly, as Ramon's pointed out, they haven't developed the right antibodies to protect them against this new one. And that's why if you take the vaccine, as Ramon explained, there's a bigger, your scope for protection is better because you're protecting against that green heart.
Right. And to that point, it's because that virus, it needs that hat to survive.
Correct.
The spike protein, what we call the hat, is what it uses to bind to that lung cell so it can get in. If it doesn't have that hat, it can't get into your lung cell, which is such a good target, which is why, yes, it's trying to change it a bit, but it can't change it enough.
But then the question becomes, and I'm going to interject here because our time is going so quickly and I really want to get these questions. So then the question becomes, then why bother get vaccinated? I mean, if you get vaccinated and then you got to have a booster shot, several people ask this, well, I've got to go and have a booster shot in another couple of months. What's the sense of it?
Okay, let's talk about that quickly again. For those listening, okay? Why do I need a booster shot for flu every year, but I don't need it for measles and mumps? Why? Why are they saying we might need a booster shot for COVID? It's in part because it depends on how quickly does this virus change. The flu changes like that, changes so quickly that the flu next year has a yellow coat. The flu this year had a red coat. So they find which flu it is this year, kill it, and that's what that vaccine is for the year. So far, the vaccines are still working against this virus because the hat hasn't changed enough. If we don't get vaccinated, then we can become a host for this thing to multiply in. And if it multiplies, it can change the hat. If it changes the hat, yes, we're going to need another booster. Right now, no one can say we'll need a booster yet because it hasn't changed past that yet. It's a race against time. Do we vaccinate so many people that it can't multiply? We've coughed him and shot him every time that it dies off, or we don't get vaccinated, and every time it infects somebody, you've given it a chance to change. You've given it a chance to be a new monster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that leads us to the other one, several questions here. Herd immunity. And people are kind of feeling pressured, Dr. Ayo, about the herd immunity. Why are we telling Bermudians that the vaccine immunity is better than natural immunity, which we just kind of talked about?
Yep.
And then why are we telling people that we need 2/3 of our population to achieve herd immunity? Someone's going so far as to say that's a blatant lie. As everyone knows, the vaccine does not confer immunity. Well, you know.
Okay.
And then somebody said, explain immunity. I will say to some, you did a good job with it, Dr. Ramon. And then 70 to 70% of the people who are vaccinated won't get seriously ill, but that's widely known. Since the very start, the overwhelming majority, 80 to 90 people who catch it already got mild to no symptoms. And really about that.
Okay.
I see both of you ready to go. Yeah.
Well, I'll make a start because I think I have been explaining this in the past, so I'll make a start. Right. What happens when you have a population exposed to a new infection like this virus is that it infects people. And when one person is infected, for a virus like measles, you can infect as many as 18 other people from one person being infected. That's a very contagious virus, measles. We're fortunate that this virus isn't that as bad as measles. So it usually is between 2 and 3 people that one person would infect on the average. So to be able to get to a situation where you can stop this virus from spreading, catch him, cough him, kill him, as Ramon explained, you need to have a proportion of your population immune, so that even when this virus comes in, it can be caught and killed before it gets a chance to spread around. And that's what happens. So that's a mathematical calculation that has to do with how much this can, how many people each person can infect. And that's how we get to the 70%. Now that is then the number of people that you need to protect before you can get immunity is different. So when we talk about herd immunity for measles, we're talking about 95% of the population. When we're talking about herd immunity for a virus that's not as infectious as measles, as SARS-CoV-2, as we're talking about now,
Dr. Oscar, yeah, I know you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, so Dr. Ayo's point, it's a numbers game. Okay, remember when I said it's a race against time?
Yeah.
If right now the gunman, the bad guy, has a green hat, and 70% of the people he runs into say, "Oh, he's got a green hat, cuff him and shoot him." Therefore, he can't spread again, and we've only left 3 out of 10 people where he can infect. Every 2 out of 3 people, he dies, and that's the number that they've worked out. They said, okay, with this model, the virus will die off. Short of that, he has enough people he can infect, so he has enough people to live on, and enough people in which he could potentially change to a purple hat and then come back again and infect everybody. So it's a numbers game. It really is, and that's why it's a race against time. As long as we don't reach that threshold, which is calculated mathematically, then there are enough people out there in which you've given it a chance to change and giving it a chance to come back again. Remember, SARS was corona. It had a 10% mortality. MERS, that was 2003. MERS was corona in 2012. It had a 34.6% mortality. 1 in 3 people died. This one is back in COVID-19. So we need to get to the point where there's so few people left, eventually die off. And that's how they got to the number.
So do you have a reference, a country that has reached herd immunity? Have we seen this effectively anywhere?
Yep, I can talk to that.
Mhm.
Earlier on this week, I was speaking to colleagues, and actually, Di was at the meeting. I was speaking with colleagues from England, and there were a couple of experts who actually advised the island of Gibraltar on their vaccination program. Ladies and gentlemen, the island of Gibraltar had an outbreak as bad as what we had now earlier on in the year. It was really terrible. A lot of people died and a lot of people were hospitalized. But they used that to galvanize themselves. Had been vaccinated. 90% of the adults in Gibraltar has been vaccinated. And guess what? In the last 4 weeks, they've not had not one case of coronavirus, of COVID in Gibraltar, not one. They can now have music festivals. People can go to theaters. People can go to the restaurants. They can go to each other's houses. There's no restrictions in that sense. So it is possible, Bermuda.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that finally?
Uh-huh.
Until we get to that point, until we get to that number, it's the reason people are saying, well, I got the vaccine. Why do I still have to wear a mask?
Yeah, that's coming.
It's because there are enough people out there in which this thing could change to a purple hat that it might come back and get me.
Yeah.
So you're like, okay, I got the vaccine. I'm protected for now.
Yeah.
But
And I want to go to
anyway, I'll let you continue. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you, but I want to go to that because that is a question. Why do I still have to wear a mask? Why, and then this is a big question here. For all of us that are fully vaccinated, how come we're being treated like this? Like we're, we can't do this, we can't do that. We're being treated, and several people talk about they just feel the pressure from government, but we'll talk about that. Why do I still have to wear a mask? Why, if I'm vaccinated, fully vaccinated, can't I move around like I want to? Talk to me about that. It seems unfair.
Yeah,
go ahead,
Ramon, yeah.
take it.
Okay,
Ramon, go for it, Ramon.
Okay, no problem. So again, all right. So the one thing outside of a vaccine that's going to stop us from this thing multiplying and changing, if it can't get into a host, it can't change. Okay? If it can't get into a host, it can't change. That's why if you have your mask on, vaccine or not, I can't get infected. And if I can't get infected, then it can't multiply and it can't potentially change the hat. Okay? So that's why social distancing and wearing the mask, whether you're vaccinated or not, is so important. Now, those of the population that are vaccinated, like, okay, why am I wearing a mask? Like, I got my security force. It's in the event we haven't reached where like half the population is not vaccinated. So there are people out there against. So you're still protecting yourself. Okay? Because if you caught the green hat, you're going to cuff him and shoot him. So you have a very low likelihood of passing it on to your family and very low likelihood of getting sick. The data says you're not even going to get sick, but even though you caught it. The rest have to wear the mask because they don't want to be the vector to create this monster. And the reason the government said, well, listen, we're going to have to lock down. Why? Because obviously, if they're not wearing the mask and they're not social distancing, they've now allowed themselves to catch it. And if they didn't have the security force to cuff them and shoot them, it's getting them sick, but also potentially creating a monster in our country that the rest who are even vaccinated won't be protected against. So the government is trying to, again, head this off at the pass. Say, look, I don't want to create a new monster one. And those who are catching it, it has like a 3% mortality, 2% mortality. We went from 12 deaths to 23. That's like 2 people every month if you average it. So that's why we're still wearing masks.
Yeah, and I know you all can appreciate that people are wearing thin. You're seeing it in the United States, a lot of resistance to wearing masks right now. Let me go to, and Daiwan, I see you having a quick sip of water, and I just want to do this one, because we did talk about deaths. People, it's funny, I was talking to a lady, and she was like, why isn't government putting about more about the deaths, people dying? Why are we not sharing as much information about that? And I think you did answer the question about, has someone been vaccinated? Have they passed in the hospital? Has there been any deaths? Just talk about why we don't, or why they talk about it. Go ahead.
Sure. I think I did mention earlier that we have a surveillance officer that codes for underlying cause of death. And we always follow World Health Organization guidelines for how we code deaths as well. And then there's also, I talked about information for action. And this is person's private information when someone dies. So we want to be able to say that, yes, we have had a death with someone diagnosed with COVID, but there's some information that should be personal to that person. So I do see people saying, did they have comorbidities? Did they have this? Did they have that? It's not fair to the person, even in death, and it's not fair to the family to release lots of information. So for a COVID death for surveillance purposes, it is any person that has been diagnosed with COVID and has a clinically compatible illness, which, there are asymptomatic infections, but has a clinically compatible illness, and dies for something that's not traumatic, without any period of recovery between diagnosis and death. So we will say that there was a death, but it's ultimately the physician that determines what caused, well, not ultimately, but the physician completes the death certificate. And based on what the physician writes on the death certificate, we will then code to see if this is ultimately a COVID-19 death, or if it is a death among a person with COVID. So you'll see that other countries, especially earlier in the pandemic, would have said, oh, we had X number of deaths due to COVID. And then once it goes through the process of the death certification, they might retract that number a little bit. So we do review the death certificates, and all of them so far have listed COVID as the underlying cause of death for the deaths that we have reported with COVID.
So it's a matter of how much information needs to go in the public domain about the personal information. Yeah? That one? Go ahead. About the personal information. It's really how much information the public really needs to know in terms of...
The public needs to know information for action. So if around the world we know that a certain age group is dying, so that puts them at greater risk of death. If we know around the world globally that persons that are unvaccinated are dying, Bermuda is another world, but we're not another world. So think about what information you truly need to change your actions. So that's the balance that we try to give. Respect for the family, respect for the person in their privacy, and making sure that people know what's going on around the world and how it can impact them.
Okay. I want to just go to some specifics about the vaccine. Several people who have written in about specific diseases and underlying medical conditions. Someone asked a question, I've heard this before, will this vaccine cause autism? Is it safe for pregnant women? There was also the question about brain aneurysms as well. And one person asked a question, do we fully ask people about their health conditions before they take the vaccine? And if we don't, why not? Who's going? Dr. Ayo, you going?
Yeah, I'll take the last question first. So we do ask about all of vaccine recipients' medical history, and we take that as a matter of course. Anybody who's been to the vaccine centers will know that that question is asked, and that is recorded because it's important for us to be able to keep those records as well. So that happens as a matter of course. So we can talk about that straight away. The other question was about pregnant women.
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, you can give it in pregnant women. So in the last 2 weeks, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the Joint Committee on Vaccinations in the United Kingdom, reviewed 90,000 cases or where pregnant women have been vaccinated because either because they're health workers or they're higher risk, and they did not find any adverse effects associated with that. So that's 90,000, and therefore the recommendation is if you are pregnant, actually your risk of dying or being hospitalized from COVID is actually higher. So it's in your interest to take the vaccine, really. It's a recommendation from these august bodies. And also closely linked to that is that of lactating mothers. There was some concern that this may be expressed in breast milk, and that was not specifically looked at in the trials. But again, there's been plenty of data now since the vaccines have been out in the real world to show that there is no risks associated to that. If you're pregnant or lactating, please don't feel that the vaccine is not for you.
And what about brain aneurysms? There's been some concern that, again, if people have underlying conditions, that it will affect.
Okay. Well, no. There's no. I can't think of any mechanism of action for brain aneurysms to be worsened by this vaccine. Remember, Karika mentioned what is in the vaccine. There's nothing in that vaccine that would either worsen a brain aneurysm or cause a brain aneurysm to burst. It does not increase the pressure in the brain. So there is no mechanism of action for this vaccine to affect brain aneurysms at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's a question that's come through. It's a couple of people, and I think I'd like us to talk about this. There several people are saying we're not talking about a holistic approach. We're not talking about vitamins. We're not talking about how we eat, what we eat in terms of managing this public health crisis. And the question is, why not? I mean, I know, of course, they'll say, oh, they're physicians, they're doctors, give them medicine, give them a vaccine. But people are asking, well, you're not talking about all the other things that could be going on to promote health and people stay healthy. Go ahead, go with that.
Okay, Ramon, you want to take that first?
Sure. Thanks for that question. Great question. I was actually teaching immunology to some A-level students on Monday, and one of them asked me that very question, and they said, what about all these alternative medicine? If you go to the hospital and why they don't talk about vitamins, etc. And I was like, listen, I don't like the term alternative because I truly believe you should use the term complementary. Mm-hmm. It's not an either or. I'm all for, in fact, I holistically support eating healthy, take your vitamins, everything that you know to boost your immune system, because you need to be able to mount that response when you get it. But I don't put it in place of the vaccine. There are certain things that I'm like, listen, I really believe you should take this because I know it will help you. And there's certain things where I'm like, you know what? If you want to try the alternative, the complementary thing alone without taking anything, that's okay because medicine can't do much better, right? In this particular instance, I think they complement each other. I want you to eat healthy. I want you to take your vitamins, but I want you to have the security force if this monster, if this virus, if this intruder ever breaches your house. because it's dangerous enough that if you don't have the security force, and God forbid you weren't eating healthy, that you could end up in hospital and you could die.
Yeah. If I could add to that very briefly, so yeah, that's absolutely correct. If it's the body that COVID meets, that COVID can affect. So if you're fit and healthy and young, your immune system is good from eating healthily, keeping your weight down and doing enough exercise, yes, your baseline immunity is good and reduces your risk. However, it does not reduce your risk to zero. The best tool we have in the toolbox to prevent this infection is actually vaccination. So yes, it's absolutely important to eat healthily. It's absolutely important to keep your weight down to reasonable levels. It's absolutely important to make sure that you have your 5 portions of fruit and veg every day. It's absolutely important to have 30 minutes of moderate physical exercise every day. However, that improves the body that COVID can, if COVID attacks you, you're starting from a good place. But your best tool at this point in time is still the vaccination.
I want to just add one more piece to that as well. It's a public health concern. I know that, I don't even like eating vegetables, and that's my mom knows that. But yes, personally, I should eat more vegetables. I should exercise and I'll be healthy. But there are people who are fit as a whistle, who have been positive for the virus, have transmitted the virus, and had no clue they had the virus. That's where it becomes, it's not just about me. It's not just about you. It's about, what about everyone else? What about the person you give it to who isn't in a position to fight this off, for whatever reason? Yes, I may not have symptoms, but that doesn't mean I can't give it off to someone else. And we've seen, again, with the data I shared earlier, with the vaccination, you are reducing how infectious you are. And so you won't be able to give it off as well. I think Dr. Oscar had something to say as well.
To that public health announcement, thank you so much, Dr. Weldon. You're fit, you're healthy, you eat your vegetables, you catch COVID, you don't even know you had it. It multiplied in you, and suppose it changed in you. And you passed that variant on. Remember I showed it could change and pick up a bigger gun? Now it's more deadly. No, you've passed it on to somebody who may be just as healthy or not as healthy as you, and it's worse for them. Or suppose it changed its hat. You've been fine, but you've been the vessel in which this thing has managed to change enough that no one else is protected. So thinking about, oh, well, I'm just going to eat healthy and I'll be fine. You've now put not just yourself at future risk, but the whole society at risk of a new monster that's not yet on our shores.
And let's talk of the 2 things. I want to talk asymptomatic folks, because there's been a lot of discussion about who's asymptomatic, what is asymptomatic, how do you know? I want to talk about the antibody test, because I have heard about that. That's coming. And then I want to talk about the effects on fertility, because, as a mother of young, 20 daughters in their 20s, you get that question. Well, my fertility, you want grandchildren? Should I do this vaccine? It's really. So let's talk about that. I want to talk about the fertility, also talk, somebody else pick up on the asymptomatic persons as well. Go ahead.
I mean, I can speak to asymptomatic a bit, primarily because I'm the first person that sees who is positive for most cases, with the layout. And on the form, sometimes it says they have symptoms, and most times it's empty. I know that we report those cases, and then case management and contact tracers will call, but you do have a lot of people that just didn't even have a clue that they had it. I mean, I have family members myself who didn't have any symptoms, and it's just that thought that maybe I could have been, this catalyst that gave it to others that really haunt you. And I have had dreams about it, to be very honest. That's how much I talk about COVID every day. But it's just knowing that, okay, I could have passed it on to someone else. It's very much a real thing. And I know there's another part that kind of like deviates over that, is about children. Children can't be vessels of the virus. Well, we've just kind of proven that isn't right. Unfortunately, in the other outbreak in December, we had a few children, maybe less than 10, that did test positive. But I mean, we saw it ravage through the schools, and a lot of them didn't have symptoms. So a body is a body, right? There's all the virus ones, like Dr. Asghar is saying, is a machine. It just needs the things to make itself again. And it doesn't necessarily matter how old you are, what your name is, none of that. So we have to be careful that we don't get complacent and say, well, no, I can't have the virus because I'm not sick. You can't.
I just want to chime in here. So when persons do go get tested, they will often say that, oh no, I'm asymptomatic. But the data that we have through Week 13, which is about 3 weeks ago, showed that around a third of the cases were actually asymptomatic, which meant that 2/3 were symptomatic. So once the contact tracers or case managers talk to the cases, they were like, oh, I did have this symptom. Oh, I did have this, but I thought it was just, I was run down that day or whatever. So I think it's very important for people to recognize what the symptoms are, and to be like, oh, well, this might be how I usually feel this time of year, but let me just double check to see if this might be COVID or something else. So just symptoms, headaches, loss of taste and smell, just try and be aware of the symptoms. They are listed on our website as well.
Yep, and yeah, thank you very much for that, Daiwan. The other thing to add to that is, while yes, we do have a third of the cases on Ireland don't have any symptoms, what Dr. Weldon might be seeing might be at a time when they just got the disease, so it's pre-symptoms rather than asymptomatic. So they just caught the disease. The virus is basically, they have not been vaccinated. The virus is multiplying in their system, and they have not yet had the symptoms. And if you take a graph, it climbs up. And if you take a sample at that time, they're positive and really, really positive at that point in time. But the symptoms hasn't started. It might start a day or two after that. And that's what a lot of people find. And the other thing we found with this new variants that we're dealing with on Ireland is that there's a lot more atypical symptoms. So symptoms associated more with allergy type symptoms. So it's springtime, there's a lot of pollen in the air, you might take that sniffle, it's just allergies. Actually, that's what a lot of people present with, and that's why we're encouraging people to test. If you have more allergy-like symptoms than the traditional fever, cough, loss of taste and smell.
The question that I wanted to get to, and I want to thank everyone that's staying with us to hear the questions, and for submitting your questions. Also recommend that you go back and review this. It will be on Facebook. CITV will have it up as well, because several of the kind of questions that I'm getting about blood clots and things, we did review that earlier. So there is information in there. But let's go to
if you look at all the major journals, said that there's absolutely no evidence or incidence of infertility from the vaccine. Remember, it's just a hat. It's not the virus. It's literally a bit of protein that they've given you. It's not going to go and try and affect your eggs or your sperm or your ability to get pregnant. To give you some numbers, in early March, 200 million people had been vaccinated worldwide already. So we're talking about 6 weeks ago. Of the 200 million, they've been tracking it. There's been no increase incidence of infertility vaccines, which to your point, have been tested for over 5 years, the vaccines themselves. And so that trial didn't start last year and have been worked on for more than 30 years. If you were to get a symptom or sign, it happens in the first 6 weeks. First 6 weeks. We've been doing these vaccines for
200 years.
For years, over 5 years. We've been doing the trials, and over 30 years we've been doing the research. So a lot of people say, I don't want to be a guinea pig. And I always tell them, well, there have been 200 million people already. There have been over 5 years of trials with this number. What's your threshold of saying, I'm no longer the guinea pig? So so I understand the trepidation. They're like, what if? But the incidence is, they have it now as on the website, CDC, that there is no evidence that it causes fertility problems. And that's based on the raw numbers.
I mean, I can definitely agree. Like, it is a concern. It was my concern, actually, when I first heard about the vaccine. I was like, oh, that's nice. I'll just sit on the sidelines and watch it happen. And then I realized, yeah, I probably can't do that. Let me look into it, because I am in that, I guess, age bracket. I'm 30 now. I haven't had children yet. I want to have them, and I'm worried about it. And so it took me about 6 weeks of my own digging to get comfortable. And when I really saw what was in the vaccine, and that none of those things can affect my fertility, and obviously my own background knowledge of how mRNA vaccines worked and what mRNA is, then I felt comfortable. But it's definitely a valid concern. And I agree with those who have it. So it's also about, where did this come from? Where did this claim come from? And sometimes that has to be looked at too.
Yeah. You know what? You made a great point. Look, stay right there, Dr. Weldon, because the internet, is full of all kinds of different theories. And this one says this, and this one says that. And unfortunately, people, that's where they get their information from. How does someone process that information? How do you screen it to figure, are your sources legit? Is it legit? And somebody asked that of you too, Dr. Ayo. Your sources, are your sources legit? But go ahead, Dr. Weldon. How does,
when it comes to, just if I backtrack to my old life, when I was in the lab, far away, when you want to look at a problem, you have to find papers on both sides. I mean, in science, it's always conflicting arguments. There are people that think this is that the earth was flat. Some people think the earth was round, and they have their evidence to support. When you look at a topic, you have to look at both sides and see what is their evidence. Why would they be saying this? Because there are motives. People have motives for saying things. In this day and age, with the super mass information age, if I can call it that, you have to look at the source. Reuters is, I think, a good source. They will fact check things, and they have a lot of articles where they've had to fact check certain myths that we're even talking about now. A doctor somewhere, not saying that all doctors are not great, but some have their motives, and so you have to look at, why would they be saying this? Even when it comes to pharmaceutical companies, that's another big thing. Oh, big pharma is just trying to gain some money from us. But what will be their motive? Ultimately, this disease has driven through the world. We've all been affected worldwide. And, there's this discussion about our people being affected in a different way to other races. And it's just about, what is the source? Look at both sides of the argument of what's going on.
You said Reuters, or what did you say?
I said routers. I think I might say it.
Okay, Reuters. Okay, Reuters news agency.
Yeah.
No. But listen, I don't know, because I'm gonna. You don't know what site it's like. Okay, so Reuters News
Yeah.
Before you come to consensus on anything, you get a lot of people researching the same thing. It's a bit like an elephant. If you're touching an elephant blindfolded, somebody might touch the leg and think, oh, this is a tree, and somebody might touch the side and say, this is a wall. So because you're looking at a small part of the whole picture. So before the way science works is that before you can come to a consensus on things, you need to get all the available evidence and put it together. And then you can be able to stand apart and see that, oh, actually, I'm looking at an elephant. So if you then choose only the papers that tells you that, that tells you that touches the leg, they might tell you that, oh, we're dealing with a tree. And that's the way science works. Now, what I advise people to do is look at people whose job it is to pull together all the evidence and then say, what is this telling us? And the people who do that, the WHO, that is what they're set up to do, is to pull together all the evidence that's available on any particular topic and say, this is the latest stage. Where the research is, and this is what pulls together all the papers in the big research collaborations called the Cochrane Reviews. So it's not about, oh, somebody's had this paper, another person comes out with a different paper, because they're all looking at bits of that elephant. Somebody's touching the toe and think that that's a pebble. Somebody's touching the air and feels it together. Don't look at individual studies because they don't tell you the whole picture. Okay. I know Ramon wants to come in.
Yeah, so this is, and everybody who's been in science, every time somebody makes an assertion, they ask you, what level is someone's opinion? And the highest one being, look, we're going to do trials on thousands of people where the people in the trial, they don't know whether they got the vaccine or not. The person looking at the trial and looking at the results doesn't know who got the vaccine or not, right? That's what you call randomized control trial. A Nature paper, a Cell paper, or a Science paper, right? I mean, those were like huge journals, and then you get New England Journal of Medicine, and that's how in the field we're like, okay, this is a good paper because it was really reviewed by all sides. There was no bias, and they're like, okay, but how does the layman know, oh, is this a good paper or not? There are certain places like what Dr. Ayo said, like the WHO, they put value on those recommendations. The CDC, they put value on the rigor of that data. A good website that I found, I'll just show it to you now, that not only will it tell you both sides, but it will send you to where it came from, where that information came from, is one called fullfact.org. Okay, I'll just share my screen quickly, and so you can all write it down.
Which is good because, you know, I have someone that said, you know, in their 20s and they're hearing all kinds of different stories and different things. So where could they go? And you're absolutely right. WHO, CDC, and now this
giving you up to date, like today.
Good.
Okay, and then they'll say, okay, and this study said X, and you click on it and it sends you to the study, so you can actually drill down. Was this randomized? Was this controlled? How powered was it? Did it have a lot of people in the study? Was it even studied, or was it somebody's opinion? Right? Were they just looking at the vaccine, or did this person get all kind of other treatments along with it, and then they're attributing the result to the vaccine and not to the other treatment? I mean, there's so much that goes into, does this work or not?
Yeah,
I totally get the confusion, but this is a good source.
good. And thank you for sharing that. Now listen, we're down to 4 minutes. We're almost 9 o'clock. We've been at this for 2 hours. Can you believe it? Woo!
Can I
And,
jump in just for a moment, Tina?
say that again.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. Because we've talked about going to information that just, might not. What people really need to look out for is disinformation. With the intent to not just talking about COVID. There are some things that you can. I mean, Karika and I, this, but then you'll have those other ones. That's the types of signs that you're.
Folks, thank you. Because we did have a couple of questions about the regulations, staying positive on day 14, national address. To hear what's next. Vaccinated after the regulation. Hands.
Yes,
Outside. The people that won't stay. There's not been enough science. The folks after we go back up.
I'll go first. What we know. You have your own doctor. So speak to them if you what impact of the decisions you. It's about what things you choose to do. I'll leave it at that.
Good. Dr. Ascott, you want to have a, we did say tonight, people, we want. We're just trying to help you.
But fine. But you may have been the vessel in which you've created a new monster and possibly change the whole dynamic of society. Or it might pick up a bigger gun. And you're looking to change, you're going to catch it again 3 months from now. And we can't get to cuff him and shoot him on a. If not going to get the vaccine, then, think society and think about just at least don't be the vessel. That's all I'm asking, because we don't.
Thank you.
More from a selfish standpoint, I guess. Is like burdened, right? And this, I know, having that many people, for the staff that are there, is possible. But if we are in, I know Dawan can speak. If you are going to make that, wear your mask, social distance. Generations, and then we saw it kind of spread. But this time it's reached about long COVID. We haven't. Can't say that enough. I mean, I have some of my staff have sometimes covered months now, and this is people my age and younger. To get vaccinated, because we're all in this together.
That's good stuff. And you're right, we did get.
And I'm not sure about, but the other public health, don't wear a seatbelt, which you must continue to obey the rules of the road, even if you're not going to get vaccinated.
I think that's a good way to end. We're and speak with your loved ones. And I want to thank you for marrying a Bermudian and a Bermudian. Conferences, but we may do this again. And surveillance. Proud of you and keep up the good work. Thank you for joining us. And go through the information. Is on live now. Star and artist. Thank you for joining me.
Good night, everyone. Take care.
Please click on the other link, the new link in the that was sent out earlier. That's due to start at 9 o'clock. I'm clicking on that link now. Go over to that space for our follow-up presentations where we will debunk the debunkers, right? Because somebody's got to get the other side of this story. All right, so click in over there. See you on the other side.